Today, we are breaking down the absolutely unprecedented U.S. military operation in Venezuela. We're talking about the capture of its sitting head of state, Nicolas Maduro. So let's get right into how this all went down and what it could possibly mean for the future.
I mean, talk about a dramatic announcement. President Trump himself used this quote to describe the operation. A statement like that, well, it immediately told the world just how big of a deal this was, and of course kicked off a massive international firestorm.
So, let's start with the basics. What exactly happened on the ground in Caracas? Let's break down the core events of this, well, unbelievable raid.
So get this, in a super-planned overnight mission, the U.S. Army's elite Delta Force drops into the Venezuelan capital. Their target? None other than President Nicolas Maduro and the First Lady Celia Flores. They were taken right from their home inside Fuerte Tuna, which is the country's biggest military complex. Just incredible.
And right after they were captured, they were gone. Whisked out of the country, flown straight to New York. They're now being held in U.S. federal custody, right in Brooklyn, waiting to go to court to face a whole slate of really serious charges.
Okay, so this brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why would the U.S. take such an extreme, such an extraordinary step? Let's take a look at the official reason the administration is giving. For years, this number, $15 million, has basically been hanging over Maduro's head. The U.S. government put out this massive reward for any information that would lead to his arrest. So you can see they weren't framing him as a political leader, but as a wanted man.
And here's why. A federal grand jury indicted Maduro on charges that are, well, they're incredibly severe. They're accusing him of running a giant criminal network that the U.S. calls narco-terrorism. We're talking about using drug trafficking to fund and arm terrorist groups. So in the eyes of the Justice Department, he wasn't a president, he was a fugitive from American justice.
And this quote from the Attorney General, it really just crystallizes the whole administration's position. The message couldn't be clearer. This was not an act of war. No, this was an act of law enforcement, just on a global scale.
But of course, an operation like this, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It was really the final move after more than a decade of the U.S. turning up the pressure. Let's look at the timeline that got us here.
And to really understand this long road, we can look at nonpartisan sources like this report from the Congressional Research Service. It basically lays out the whole history of U.S. sanctions against Venezuela, step by step.
And you can just see how things kept ratcheting up. It started way back in 2005 over fighting drug trafficking. Then it moved to blocking arms sales, then sanctions for human rights abuses. And then it got personal, with sanctions targeting President Maduro himself. Finally came the big one, hitting the absolute lifeblood of Venezuela's economy, its state oil company. This long history, where sanctions just didn't seem to work, is really the key context for why they eventually decided to use military force.
As you can probably guess, the second this operation went public, a huge, fierce debate just exploded right here in the U.S. The big question, was this a legitimate arrest, or was it an illegal act of war? The administration's position was put, well, pretty bluntly by the defense secretary. This quote really captures that feeling that, in their view, Maduro had crossed a line one too many times and basically invited this kind of response.
But the pushback was immediate, and it was severe. You have Representative Jim Himes, a top Dem on the House Intel Committee, just coming right out and saying this whole thing violates both international law and the U.S. Constitution. You know, the part that gives Congress the power to declare war.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio immediately doubled down, hammering home the administration's main argument. He kept stressing that this was all about law enforcement. The goal was to bring indicted people to trial, not to start a war or topple a government.
And here, the Senate Minority Leader really nails the core of the opposition's argument. He's basically saying, look, we all agree Maduro's a bad guy, but you can't fight lawlessness with more lawlessness. He argues that the way the U.S. did this was itself unlawful and set a really dangerous precedent.
So it all boils down to this deep, deep divide. On one side, people see it as a necessary police action against a narco-terrorist, but on the other, it's seen as an unconstitutional act of war that could give countries like Russia and China a green light to do similar things to their neighbors.
Now, this debate wasn't just happening in Washington. This operation sent absolute shockwaves across the entire globe, pretty much forcing every nation to pick a side.
And the geopolitical split was instant. You had U.S. rivals with close ties to Venezuela, Russia, China, North Korea, all immediately condemning it as illegal aggression. On the flip side, key allies like Israel came out with strong support. And then you had others, like the European Union and even the Vatican,
who were much more cautious, basically urging for calm and respect for international law.
And what about on the ground in Venezuela? Well, the aftermath was just this kind of tense quiet. Reports said that while the capital was calm, people were lining up at stores, stocking up on food and supplies, just completely unsure of what was going to happen next.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Was this a historic moment of justice, finally bringing a corrupt leader to trial? Or was it a reckless move that breaks international law and hands a playbook to our adversaries? The truth is, the debate on this is really just getting started.